Hello and welcome to our Bible study 2021. We're beginning with a study of the Gospel of Matthew. It's the first of the Gospels in the New Testament, though it's not necessarily the oldest or the earliest to have been written. Although the Gospel of Matthew does rank first, it's clearly not the first chronologically. It's certainly later than Mark's Gospels, although some have speculated that Mark's Gospel might have been a condensation, a compilation from the other Gospels, but most scholars don't think that's really credible. The structure of Matthew's Gospel is it's in five main sections, 5 books reflecting the Pentateuch, like the new Torah, the 5 books of Moses, consistent with his gospel, having more of a Jewish flavor, perhaps, than the other gospels. And one of the characteristics is Matthew's always saying, "It is written," "it is said," and quoting from usually the Old Testament. Each of these books, each of these 5 sections, rests on an extended teaching discourse by Jesus. So we're going to look today at the introduction, the first couple of chapters, which contain a genealogy and a birth narrative. Now, we did look at these somewhat in the season of Advent last month. We'll just review a little bit of that. And then after that introduction, the first book or first main section comprises chapters 3 through 7, including a narrative about the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And the discourse in this section is the most famous one we call the Sermon on the Mount, and that's chapter 5, 6, and 7. The discourse itself begins, as each of them do, with something akin to Jesus went somewhere, sat down and began to teach, or he saw the crowds, something like that. And in chapter 5, verses 1 to 2, it says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. And after he sat down, the disciples came to him, and he began to speak. And he spoke for 2 chapters. And the discourse ends, as these discourses often do, in chapter 7, verse 28, now when Jesus had finished saying these things, and then the crowd were astounded, etc. But he usually ends up, when he finished speaking, he left. He went somewhere else. Book 2, the second main section, is in chapters 8, 9, and 10, having a narrative about Jesus' healing and teaching ministry. The discourse in this section is the mission of the disciples from chapter 9, verse 35 to chapter 10, verse 42. The discourse begins in 9, really 36 and 7. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, and then a little bit, then he said to his disciples, etc. And it ends really with the first verse of the 11th chapter, now when Jesus had finished, like that. Okay, we're going to move on now to the third book. The third book, or third main section of Matthew's Gospel, begins in chapter 11, following that section of verse 1, now when Jesus had finished. And it goes all the way through chapter 13, verse 52. So 11, 12, and 13, with a narrative of growing opposition to Jesus, and the discourse being one about the hidden teachings of the parables. It's all of chapter 13, 1 to 52. The discourse begins right at the beginning of chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Jesus went out, he sat beside the sea, great crowds gathered, he got in a boat and sat there, and he told them many things. Okay, so you get the idea of how this is usually put together. And it ends in chapter 13, really verse 53, when Jesus had finished these parables, he left that place. Now, book 4, section 4, begins really in 13, verse 53, is a long one, goes all the way through verse 35 of chapter 18, the narrative about messiahship and the suffering. And the discourse sounds a little odd to say it this way. It's about the administration of the church. And that is chapter 17, verse 24 to chapter 18, verse 35. That discourse begins in 17, 24, 25, 26. When they reached Capernaum, Jesus spoke of it first, saying, and then it concludes really in the first verse of chapter 19, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee. And finally, book 5, chapter 19, all the way through chapter 25, The narrative is about all the controversies in Jerusalem. There were a number of controversial situations. And the discourse is of Jesus criticizing the scribes and Pharisees in chapter 23. And then a second part of this discourse is about the parousia, the coming, the second coming, the end of the age, that sort of thing, in chapters 24 and 5. And then Matthew's gospel moves on to include a passion narrative. Now, the passion narrative was not original to Matthew, though he has his own take on it, but it was probably an independent writing because the passion narrative was probably the earliest written part of the Gospels, and each of the Gospels has some very similar depictions of the last week or so of Jesus' life, his passion, his crucifixion. And then finally, chapter 28 is all about Jesus' resurrection. All right, so that's kind of the overview of Matthew. Now we're going to go back and we're going to look at that introduction. The introduction to Matthew's gospel begins chapter 1, verse 1 through 17, with a really exciting introductory statement called a genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. He is one of the goals of the gospel is to place Jesus in terms of being a son of David and a son of Abraham, as well as the son of God. And the genealogy runs from Abraham through David to Jesus. And we're not going to go through all of these, but you can follow a lot of this in the Torah, the list of who begat whom and all of that. But you start with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Judah, who was Jacob's son, the one from whom Judaism got its name, through Tamar. It's an interesting story. You ought to read it from the Old Testament. And then a number of other of those descendants, all the way up through Obed, then Jesse, and then David, who became King David. And it's interesting, it says, from Uriah's wife. And of course, that was Bathsheba. And this is not the child conceived before Uriah was killed. This is the child conceived after David and Bathsheba married, but Uriah is still considered the husband of Bathsheba, but David is the father. And then Solomon is their son, and he's next in line. Rehoboam, who's another king, Abijah, Asaph, and it goes on, all the way up through Josiah, Jeconiah, and that is the time of the exile in Babylon, about 587, 586 BC. On through that exile time and the return, the kings that reigned, and even after the exile, the family tree, which is up to some question by scholars, but it leads up to Joseph, whose father was Jacob. And then it says that Joseph, of course, who was the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus. Now, it makes a point in Matthew's gospel of saying that there are 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David, following David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 following the exile to Jesus. Well, as you can see, there are 14 to David, 14 to Jeconiah and the Babylonian exile, but just 13 to Jesus. But again, the point of the genealogy is to make that connection of Jesus as human, as very much tied in with the family tree of Judaism, as well as Jesus being divine. So Matthew's gospel begins with a genealogy. He didn't learn that in writing school because it's not the most powerful writing, doesn't grip you right away. But it's meant to demonstrate that the primary goal of the gospel is to proclaim Jesus as the Messiah, the son of David, as well as Jesus, son of God. And so the genealogy traced Jesus through Joseph and David back to Abraham. And it's important to remember that biblical genealogies were more theological documents than they were historic ones. And Matthew's genealogy serves to connect Jesus to the Abrahamic covenant and to the Davidic monarchy. The connection goes to Joseph and is carefully worded, Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. And now the birth narrative in Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, the birth narrative concerning Jesus. It's really told in 4 parts. Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, might call that the Annunciation. Mary and Joseph are betrothed. They're not living together. Mary is pregnant. Now, Joseph is considered her husband, but no conjugal rights at this point. That was not acceptable, but they were tied to each other. But Mary is pregnant, and the story of Jesus' birth begins in conflict and controversy when Mary, who is engaged, betrothed to Joseph, was found to be with child. And Matthew tells us she was with child from the Holy Spirit. Of course, that's the theological explanation. Joseph is called her husband, though not fully yet, but the betrothal was much more than what we think of as an engagement. But it says he was a just or righteous man, and because of that, he did not want to expose Mary to public disgrace. So he planned to break off the engagement. He was compassionate because he broke off the engagement quietly. But the truth is that Mary's life would have been ruined regardless. Okay, that's just the reality. It's a small town. And by the way, we don't know where they were living. It doesn't tell us yet. We have a clue later on, but it doesn't say it was in Nazareth. It doesn't say it was in Bethlehem. But it's a small town. Mary's, even a private breaking of this betrothal because she was pregnant would have been a cause of great shame. She would have been estranged from society and disgraced by any other outcome than going through with the marriage. And so Joseph had a dream. An angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, told him about the Holy Spirit. Matthew's Joseph has a lot in common with the Old Testament Joseph. The angel said that Mary would have a son and that Joseph should name him Jesus because he would save his people from their sin. And Matthew, the writer, quotes Isaiah chapter 9 from the Greek translation. And it's important to recognize that Matthew and most of the authors of the Gospels spoke Greek. They read Greek rather than so much Hebrew. And that Isaiah 9 says the virgin will conceive and bear a son. Now, why that's important is that in Hebrew, it says specifically a young girl or young maiden will conceive. The assumption is a young maiden is a virgin, but there's another word in Hebrew for a virgin as opposed to a young maiden. But Joseph demonstrated his faith because when he woke up, he was with the program. He married Mary, but Matthew's careful to say that the couple had no sexual relations until Jesus had been born. And this is to further demonstrate that Joseph was physically not the father. Okay, the second section of the birth narrative, the wise men. This is unique to Matthew. It's not in the other Gospels at all. One of the enduring features is the story of wise men from the east, and they came to Herod the Great, the king. That's where they came to see him. They were called magi from the Persian Zoroastrianism, meaning magician or astrologer, following the star to find the king. Their presence represented the dawning of the day of the Messiah, the day of universal peace. And it was, of course, also very threatening to King Herod, who was easily threatened. They came to Jerusalem, frightened Herod. He was bloodthirsty. He was a tyrant who was also scared to death of being overthrown, so much that he had killed several of his own children. Herod's religious advisors quoted Micah chapter 5, verse 2, to determine where the child, the king, would be born in Bethlehem of Judea. Herod sent the wise men on to Bethlehem, not too far, just a day's journey or so, and instructed them to come back to me, which was some treachery. And they followed the star to Bethlehem, to a house where Mary and Joseph and Jesus lived. Now that's something that we often gloss over, but they were living in Bethlehem in a house. And from what comes later, evidently this is a couple of years after Jesus' birth. We don't know if the house was always theirs or when if they decided just to stay in Bethlehem after they had come there after the birth, or if they were always living in Bethlehem. I said earlier that Matthew doesn't tell us where Mary and Joseph were living when they became betrothed. Okay? So that's one of those questions out there. They brought 3 famous gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And all 3 really come from Isaiah chapter 60, verse 6, in which camels come bringing gold and frankincense, and myrrh, which is a prize from Sheba, and it mentions coming from Sheba. And remember, the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon and brought myrrh, which was a particular delicacy of Sheba in the Far East there. The wise men were warned in a dream to go home another way, and being wise men, they did. The third section is the flight to Egypt. Around that time, Joseph had another dream to flee to Egypt to protect the child, and that parallels another Joseph who went to Jesus, went to Egypt to save his family. And they stayed in Egypt until Herod was dead. Matthew quotes Hosea 11:1. And then Herod saw that he'd been tricked by the wise men, and he was infuriated. He sent and killed all children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or younger. And that gives us our clue how long it took the wise men to get there. And then the fourth section is Matthew 2:19 to 23, the return from Egypt. And the slaughter of the innocents is a horrible story. Indicated that it had taken the wise men 2 years to get to Bethlehem. And so Matthew quotes Jeremiah 31:5 about Rachel, who represents Mother Israel, weeping at the loss of the innocents. And the family was afraid to return to Bethlehem because Herod's son was now ruling and thought he might be out for revenge. So they went up north and settled in Nazareth in Galilee to avoid the possibility of revenge. And the quotation, "but he shall be called a Nazarene," is not from the Old Testament. We don't know where it's from. So that gives us a start on Matthew's gospel. Thanks so much. See you next time.